She is still playing with her little online shop, my sister announced to her guests. Such a waste of potential, my mother agreed. I smiled politely. The television screens in the venue were about to switch to breaking news. Tech mogul Emily Johnson has an empire valued at $15 billion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. My name is Emily, and I am 32 years old. I stood in the middle of a lavish Hamptons estate ballroom, surrounded by 300 of the wealthiest people on the East Coast. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the extravagant floral arrangements and the towering 5-tier wedding cake. It was my older sister Alicia tying the knot. The wedding cost $500,000, and every single detail was meticulously curated to project an image of old money and flawless family pedigree. Alicia stood at the podium in her custom designer gown, clutching a crystal champagne flute. She had always been the golden child of our family. She was the successful corporate lawyer who did everything right. I was the disappointment. The outcast who dropped out of a prestigious university to sell things on the internet. Alicia tapped her manicured fingernail against the microphone. The chatter in the room died down. She smiled that practiced beauty pageant smile that always masked her deep cruelty. I want to raise a glass to my beautiful family. Alicia projected her voice echoing across the ballroom. And a special thank you to my little sister Emily for taking time away from playing with her little online shop to be here today. I know things have been tight for you, but I hope your small business makes enough to cover your rent this month. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the crowd. The room was filled with judges and politicians and Wall Street executives. These were people who valued pedigree above all else. My mother Vivian sat next to me at the head table. She wore a silk gown that cost more than my first car. She leaned over and placed a cold hand on my arm. She did not whisper. She spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to clearly hear us. It really is a shame, Emily. You are such a waste of potential. If you had just listened to me and finished your degree, you could have been a partner at a law firm like your sister. Instead, you are still pushing boxes out of a warehouse. It is embarrassing. My mother was obsessed with appearances. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood, she spent her entire life trying to climb the social ladder. She wanted to be part of the black elite. She joined the right clubs, attended the right galas, and went into massive debt just to look the part. She strongly cultivated a narrative where Alicia was the triumphant success story and I was the mere cautionary tale. To her, Alicia was the ultimate trophy. Alicia married Spencer Montgomery, a wealthy white finance executive from a prominent family. Spencer was the final piece in my mother and her desperate puzzle for high society validation. I, on the other hand, was the dirty little secret. The daughter who chose supply chain logistics over country club memberships. I did not react. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. Over the past decade, I had learned that reacting to their emotional abuse only fueled their superiority complex. They thrived on making me feel small so they could feel large. What they did not know was that my little online shop was Omnicart. It was an artificial intelligence-driven logistics and e-commerce empire that I built from the ground up. And today was our initial public offering. Alicia continued her speech, soaking up the adoration of the crowd. She talked about how Spencer swept her off her feet and how they were destined to build a legacy together. I glanced down at the limited edition luxury watch hidden beneath the cuff of my custom-tailored blazer. Vivian leaned in again, her heavy perfume suffocating me. Do not look so miserable, Emily. Try to be happy for your sister. This is what success looks like. Pay attention, and maybe you will learn something. You should ask Spencer for some advice on your little business. He is a master of finance. Maybe he can help you organize your inventory. I forced a polite smile. I am paying very close attention, Mother, I replied softly. I knew exactly what Spencer was. while my family worshipped the ground he walked on. I had my own corporate intelligence team look into his background. Spencer liked to play the role of the brilliant hedge fund manager, but the reality was far more interesting. However, right now was not the time for my revelations. The wedding reception was flowing perfectly according to their pretentious script. The string quartet began to play softly as Alicia finally wrapped up her toxic toast. She raised her glass high and the guests followed suit. "To love, to success, and to family," Alicia declared. The crowd erupted into applause. My mother wiped a theatrical tear from her eye. But before the applause could completely fade, a sharp and piercing sound cut through the ballroom. It was the loud, rhythmic clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass. The noise was demanding and arrogant. Everyone turned their attention away from Alicia and toward the source of the sound. It was Spencer. My brand new brother-in-law stood up from his chair. He smiled maliciously as the room fell silent. He looked directly across the room and locked his pale blue eyes right onto mine. Spencer slowly lowered the silver spoon. He did not say a word to the crowd right away. Instead, he stepped away from his chair at the head table and began walking directly toward where I was sitting with my mother. The guests watched him in complete silence. He had that arrogant, confident stride of a man who believed he owned the world. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly, and his hair was meticulously styled. He stopped right behind my chair and placed his heavy hands on my shoulders. I resisted the urge to pull away from his grip. "I think Alicia missed one very important person in her lovely speech," Spencer said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. He squeezed my shoulders with a patronizing grip. "We need to celebrate my new little sister, Emily." My mother beamed with pride at her new son-in-law. She patted his hand gently. "You are too kind, Spencer," she said. Spencer walked around my chair and stood right beside me. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick cream-colored business card. He placed it face up on the table right next to my glass of sparkling water. The card had the gold-embossed logo of his investment firm, Vanguard Horizon. "I know things have been difficult for you, Emily," he said with a voice dripping in fake sympathy. "Alicia told me all about your little online project. It takes a lot of courage to try and start a business from your apartment, especially without a college degree. But courage does not pay the bills, does it?" I looked at the business card, and then up at his smug face. I did not say a word. I let him continue digging his own grave. "My firm usually handles portfolios in the tens of millions," he continued, looking around at the wealthy guests who were nodding along with his performance. "But I believe in charity, especially when it comes to family. My assistant has authorization to issue microloans for struggling minority-owned small businesses. I can set you up with a $5,000 line of credit. Consider it my welcome gift to you. You can use it to buy some better inventory for your website, or maybe even rent a small storage unit so your living room is not full of boxes." A few people at the neighboring tables chuckled softly. Alicia was watching from the podium with a satisfied smirk on her face. This was exactly what they wanted. They wanted to publicly establish the hierarchy. Spencer and Alicia at the top as the wealthy benevolent saviors, and me at the very bottom as the pathetic charity case. $5,000 is very generous. "Spencer," my mother chimed in. "Emily, you should say thank you to your brother-in-law. Do not let your foolish pride get in the way of a handout. You know you need the help." The hypocrisy of her words almost made me laugh out loud. My mother talking to me about handouts was the ultimate irony. I looked at the three of them and thought about the real history of our family finances. They loved to paint me as the helpless failure, but they conveniently forgot who funded their luxury lifestyle for the past 10 years. When I was 19 years old, I worked 3 jobs to save up $10,000 for my college tuition. My mother begged me to let her borrow it because Alicia needed to pay for a prestigious summer internship in Washington. I gave it to her, and I never saw a single dime of it back. That was why I had to drop out of school. When I was 23, I finally saved enough for a deposit on my own apartment. My mother secretly forged my signature and drained my savings account to pay off the massive credit card debt Alicia had accumulated while buying designer clothes for her law firm interviews. My family did not just lack faith in me. They actively sabotaged my future to ensure Alicia could have hers. They treated my bank account like a slush fund for the golden child. And now, here was this arrogant finance bro offering me a $5,000 microloan as if he was saving my life. Emily, did you hear me? My mother asked, her voice growing sharper. Say thank you to Spencer. It is embarrassing when you act ungrateful in front of our guests. I slowly reached out and picked up the thick cream-colored business card. I ran my thumb over the gold-embossed lettering. Spencer crossed his arms and smiled down at me, waiting for me to grovel. He lived for these moments of power. Thank you, Spencer, I said, my voice perfectly calm and even. This is a very interesting offer. Vanguard Horizon. I will make sure to keep this card. Spencer patted my shoulder again. Good girl, he said patronizingly. Just call my secretary on Monday. She will send over the paperwork. But try not to call before noon. She is very busy dealing with our high-net-worth clients. He turned around and started walking back to his seat next to Alicia. The tension in the room dissipated, and the guests went back to their expensive meals and quiet conversations. My mother let out a loud sigh of relief and took a large sip of her champagne. You see how lucky we are to have him in the family, my mother whispered to me. You really need to learn how to play the game, Emily. If you act nice to him, maybe he will introduce you to some people who can buy your little crafts. I ignored her completely. I did not care about her advice or her desperation to fit in with these people. My focus was entirely on my left wrist. I pulled back the sleeve of my custom-tailored blazer just enough to reveal the face of my watch. It was a solid gold Rolex Daytona, but nobody at my table noticed it. They were too busy admiring the tall floral centerpieces. I watched the sweeping second hand glide around the dark face of the watch. I had been coordinating with my chief operating officer and my public relations team all morning. Everything was timed down to the exact second. 10, 9, 8. The string quartet was playing a beautiful classical piece. The waiters were pouring more expensive champagne. Alicia was blowing kisses to her friends across the room. Spencer was holding his glass up, taking all the credit for the lavish event. 7, 6, 5. I took a deep breath and let the feeling of absolute calm wash over me. For 10 years I had swallowed their insults. I had smiled through their theft. I had stayed silent while they built their fake empire on the foundation of my stolen sacrifices. They thought my silence was weakness. They did not know that in the world of corporate business, silence is simply the time you take to load your weapons. 4, 3, 2, 1. I lowered my wrist and looked up at the massive projection screen behind the head table. For the past hour, it had been playing a continuous loop of romantic engagement photos, showing Alicia and Spencer walking on the beach and kissing under the Eiffel Tower. Suddenly, the string quartet stopped playing. The lead violinist looked confused as a loud burst of static echoed through the ballroom speakers. The beautiful slideshow of Alicia and Spencer abruptly vanished from the giant screen. The projector glitched violently, flashing bright green and white colors across the walls of the elegant venue. The guests stopped talking. My mother gasped and put her hand over her chest. Spencer stood up looking annoyed and signaled for the wedding planner to fix the technical issue. But it was not a technical issue. The screen stabilized and the romantic music was completely replaced by the sharp, urgent theme music of a live television news broadcast. The graphics of the financial news network filled the massive wall. A veteran anchor sitting at a sleek glass desk looked directly into the camera. We interrupt our regular programming to bring you breaking news from the floor of the stock exchange. The anchor announced, his voice echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. Today marks one of the most historic initial public offerings in the history of the technology sector. The guests at the wedding froze in their seats. People who were halfway through chewing their expensive filet mignon stopped completely. Waiters holding trays stood paralyzed like statues. Omnicart, the artificial intelligence-driven logistics and e-commerce giant, has officially gone public. The anchor continued. Shares opened high, pushing the company to a valuation of $15.8 billion. But the real story today is the visionary founder behind this massive global empire. The screen cut from the news desk to a high-definition video clip of the stock exchange floor from earlier that morning. Standing on the balcony above the cheering traders was me. I was wearing a sharp-tailored emerald green power suit. My hair was styled perfectly, and I was smiling with absolute confidence. I reached out and slammed the wooden gavel down, ringing the opening bell. Confetti rained down around me as the market officially opened. Founder and Chief Executive Officer Emily Johnson has maintained an incredibly low profile until today. The anchor narrated over the footage of me ringing the bell. Starting the company from her small apartment just 8 years ago, Johnson has quietly revolutionized global supply chain logistics. At 32 years old, she now holds a controlling majority stake, making her one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the entire country. Her personal net worth is estimated at over $9 billion. The ballroom descended into a state of absolute chaos. It was a heavy, suffocating wave of pure shock. To my left, a prominent state judge dropped his heavy silver fork. It clattered loudly against his plate, echoing sharply in the room. At the table next to us, a senior executive from a major Wall Street bank stared at the screen with his mouth wide open. He completely missed his mouth with his crystal glass and spilled expensive vintage champagne all over his custom white tuxedo shirt. Nobody cared about the spilled drinks. Nobody cared about the wedding cake. Every single pair of eyes in that massive room darted from the $15 billion valuation flashing on the giant screen to the woman sitting quietly at the head table. Me, the girl who was just publicly mocked for playing with a little online shop. The whispers started slowly and then grew into a loud, undeniable buzz. I could hear snippets of their conversations floating through the heavy air. $15 billion, someone whispered loudly. That is the little sister, another voice gasped in utter disbelief. Spencer just offered a billionaire a $5,000 loan, someone else muttered, followed by a low whistle of pure second-hand embarrassment. I slowly turned my head to look at my family. The smug superiority that had defined their existence was completely gone. It was wiped away in a matter of seconds. Spencer was still standing right next to my chair. The arrogant smirk melted off his face. His pale eyes were wide with pure terror. He looked up at the giant screen, seeing my face plastered next to the word billionaire, and then looked down at me. The color drained from his face until he looked completely sickly. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He slowly lowered his gaze to the table. There, sitting right next to my glass of sparkling water, was his thick, cream-colored business card, the symbol of his patronizing charity. It looked incredibly pathetic now. He reached out with a trembling hand as if he wanted to snatch the card back and pretend this entire interaction never happened. On the stage, Alicia was frozen tightly behind the wooden podium. Her perfect beauty pageant posture collapsed. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into dozens of tiny glittering pieces. The sharp sound of the breaking glass snapped her out of her trance. She stared at me from across the large room. Her chest heaved heavily. Her grand wedding, the most expensive and important day of her life, had just been entirely eclipsed. She was no longer the star. She was the foolish woman who had just insulted a titan of industry on an open microphone. But the best reaction belonged to my mother, Vivian. She sat frozen in the chair next to me. Her jaw hung so low I thought it might detach. Her eyes darted frantically back and forth between the television broadcast and my face. Her mind was frantically trying to process the massive cognitive dissonance. The daughter she had spent decades calling an absolute failure, a deep disappointment, and a total waste of potential, was currently being hailed by global financial experts as a certified genius. The anchor on the screen kept talking. He described the expansion of Omnicart and how my artificial intelligence software decimated the global competition. He showed detailed charts of our revenue growth. Every statistic he read was a direct heavy blow to the false narrative my family had built around me. "Emily," she whispered. Her voice was barely a squeak. It lacked all the booming authority and deep condescension she usually commanded. "Emily, is this real? Is this a joke?" I turned to look at her. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached professionalism I reserve for my most aggressive corporate competitors. "The stock market does not tell jokes, Mother," I replied quietly. The heavy silence in the ballroom was broken only by the continuous drone of the financial anchor on the massive screen. My mother stared at me. Her eyes darted from my face to the television and back again. I could almost see the gears grinding in her head as she calculated the implications of a $15 billion net worth. The woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a shameful burden was suddenly looking at me as if I was the absolute center of her universe. A miraculous transformation washed over her face. The shock melted away and was instantly replaced by a wide, beaming smile that looked entirely unhinged. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp and pressed both hands to her cheeks. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant baby girl," she cried out, her voice projecting across the silent room. She threw her arms wide open and lunged toward me. "I knew it. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Emily. Come here and give your mother a hug." She reached for me, fully expecting me to play the role of the dutiful, loving daughter in front of the wealthy guests. But I did not move forward. Instead, I took a deliberate and firm step backward. I kept my hands casually clasped in front of me, her arms wrapped around empty air. She stumbled slightly and looked at me with genuine confusion. The cameras from the guests' phones were all pointed directly at us. "Emily, what are you doing?" My mother whispered, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Come give me a hug. Everyone is watching us. We need to celebrate your massive success as a family." I looked at her outstretched arms and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold, sterile detachment of a business transaction. "You always knew I was destined for greatness." I repeated her words slowly. My voice was calm, but it carried enough weight to be heard by the surrounding tables. "Is that why you stole $10,000 from my college savings account, Mother?" The color instantly drained from her face. She dropped her arms to her sides. She looked around nervously at the guests who were now leaning in closer to catch every single word. "Emily, please," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Keep your voice down. This is not the time or the place for this. We are at your sister's wedding. People are recording us." "I think this is the perfect time," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. "You just told a room full of people that you always supported my dreams. I think they deserve to know exactly what your support looks like." Alicia had finally unfrozen from her spot behind the podium. She hiked up her heavy designer wedding gown and marched over to our table. Her face was flushed with anger and deep humiliation. She pointed a manicured finger at me. "Shut your mouth, Emily," she demanded. "You are ruining my wedding. You always have to make everything about you. How dare you accuse our mother of stealing in front of my guests?" I turned my gaze to Alicia. She was trembling with rage, but I could see the underlying panic in her eyes. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "I am not accusing her of anything, Alicia," I said simply. "I am stating a documented financial fact. When I was 23 years old, I had saved $10,000 from working 3 minimum wage jobs. I needed that money to finish my degree. But Mother forged my signature on a withdrawal slip. She took every single penny of my hard-earned money. And do you want to tell your wealthy new husband and his lovely friends what she used my college fund for?" Alicia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at Spencer, who was standing completely still. His arrogant demeanor was entirely gone. He was watching his new wife with a look of deep suspicion. "Since you are suddenly so quiet, I will tell them," I continued. She took my college savings and used it to pay off your massive secret credit card debt. You maxed out 4 different platinum cards, buying designer handbags and luxury shoes so you could pretend you belonged to a social class you could not afford. You built your fake high society image on the back of my stolen future. Loud gasps erupted from the tables closest to us. The judge who had dropped his fork earlier was now staring at Alicia with open disgust. The Wall Street executives were whispering fiercely to each other. In their world, debt and theft were common, but being publicly exposed as a fraud was the ultimate social crime. "That is a lie," my mother shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. She turned to the crowd, trying to salvage her carefully constructed reputation. "She is lying. My daughter is just confused. We used that money for family expenses. We are a good family." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I slowly unfolded it and placed it flat on the table right next to Spencer's pathetic business card. It was a high-quality copy of the bank withdrawal slip from 9 years ago. It clearly showed my mother's forged signature right next to the bank transfer routing number that led directly to Alicia's credit card account. "I always keep meticulous records, Mother," I said, tapping the paper with my index finger. "In the corporate world, we call this a paper trail. It is the one thing that liars always forget about." My mother stared at the paper as if it was a venomous snake. She started to breathe heavily. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, panicky motions. She reached out to grab the paper, but I swiftly slid it back across the table and returned it to my pocket. "You cannot do this to us, Emily," she cried, her voice dropping the fake, sophisticated accent she always used in public. "You are rich now. You have $15 billion. Why are you bringing up the past over a measly $10,000? You should be thanking us. If we had not taken that money, you would have stayed in school, and you never would have started your little company. We pushed you to succeed." The sheer audacity of her logic was staggering. She was actually trying to take credit for my success by claiming her theft was a motivational tactic. It was the absolute peak of narcissistic manipulation. "You did not push me to succeed, Mother," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You pushed me into a corner and expected me to die there quietly so Alicia could shine. You wanted me to fail. You needed me to fail so you could feel better about your own miserable, empty choices." Alicia grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, and her acrylic nails dug into my skin. "Stop talking right now," she hissed. "You are embarrassing Spencer. You are ruining his big day. He is going to leave me if you keep exposing our secrets." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I just stared at her fingers until she slowly released me under the weight of my cold glare. "I am not ruining anything, Alicia," I said. "I am just giving a toast. You invited me to speak about my little online shop. I am simply providing the full corporate history of Omnicart. It started with a stolen college fund and a family that treated me like garbage." My mother suddenly dropped to her knees right there in her expensive silk gown. She grabbed my hand and tried to press it against her face. She was sobbing loudly, producing massive fake tears that ruined her professional makeup. "Please, Emily," she wailed. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. Just give us a chance to make it right. You have so much money now. We can be a real family. You can buy us a nicer house, and we can all live happily together. We are your blood." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. For my entire life, I had craved her affection. I had worked myself to the bone trying to earn a single word of genuine praise. But looking at her now begging on the floor like a pathetic stranger, I realized I felt absolutely no connection to her. The blood in our veins meant nothing. I gently pulled my hand out of her grasp. I stepped back again, creating a clear physical boundary between my world and hers. "You do not want a daughter, Mother," I said quietly. "You want a bank account. And unfortunately for you, my accounts are completely frozen to this family." The ballroom was dead silent. The news broadcast on the screen had moved on to discussing my logistics software, but nobody was watching it anymore. The real show was happening right here at the head table. My mother stayed on the floor sobbing into her hands. Alicia stood frozen, her perfect wedding completely destroyed. And then Spencer finally moved. He took a deep breath and smoothed the lapels of his custom white tuxedo. The sheer terror that had paralyzed him just moments ago was completely gone. In its place was something much more familiar and far more dangerous. It was raw, unadulterated greed. I watched his eyes narrow as his brain rapidly calculated the massive financial opportunity standing right in front of him. A $15 billion valuation was the kind of money that hedge fund managers like him usually only dreamed of touching. He bent down and firmly grabbed my mother by the arm, pulling her up off the marble floor. He whispered something harsh into her ear that made her instantly stop sobbing. He pushed her slightly toward Alicia, who was still staring at me with a mixture of hatred and awe. Spencer then turned his full attention entirely to me. He plastered a sickeningly smooth smile on his face. It was the same smile he used when he was trying to close a massive deal with a reluctant client. "Emily, let us all just take a deep breath," he said, his voice projecting a calm, reasonable authority. "Emotions are running incredibly high right now. It is completely understandable. This is massive news, historic news, really. I have to admit I am deeply impressed. Keeping an initial public offering of this magnitude completely under the radar takes an incredible amount of strategic discipline." I did not nod or acknowledge his compliment. I just stared at him, waiting for the inevitable pitch. I knew exactly how men like Spencer operated. They saw wealth as something that inherently belonged to them, and if someone else had it, they simply needed to find the right leverage to extract it. "You have built something truly remarkable," he continued, taking a slow step toward me. "But going public is an entirely different beast than running a private startup. The scrutiny is relentless. The market volatility can wipe out billions in a single afternoon. And let us be completely honest with each other, Emily. The corporate world is not exactly welcoming. As a young Black woman in the tech industry, you are going to face obstacles and aggressive corporate raiders that you cannot even begin to anticipate. You have a massive target on your back right now." His gaslighting was textbook. He was trying to disguise his profound greed as protective concern. He was using my race and my gender as weapons to make me feel vulnerable so he could swoop in as the experienced white male savior. "That is why you need your family now more than ever," Spencer said, his voice dropping to a serious, confidential tone. "You need people you can completely trust. People who understand complex wealth management and aggressive asset protection. Vanguard Horizon manages portfolios for some of the oldest families in this country. We know how to shield assets from aggressive taxation and hostile takeovers. I can help you navigate this transition, Emily. We can keep this wealth in the family where it belongs." I looked at him with absolute disgust. He was actually trying to pitch me his firm right after offering me a $5,000 charity loan to clear out my living room. The arrogance was almost pathological. "You want to manage my wealth?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "I want to protect you," he corrected smoothly, taking another step closer. "Family protects family, Emily. I know there is bad blood here. I know Vivian and Alicia have made mistakes in the past, but today is about the future. We can merge our resources, my connections in the financial sector combined with your brilliant technology empire. We would be absolutely unstoppable." He extended his hand toward me, offering a corporate handshake to seal this imaginary partnership. I looked at his manicured fingers and felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing exactly what was coming next. "I do not need your protection, Spencer," I said clearly, so the surrounding guests could hear every word. "And I certainly do not need a failing hedge fund manager to explain market volatility to me. My company just valued at $15 billion. Your firm manages what exactly? A fraction of that on a good day. You are out of your depth. You do not want to protect my assets. You just want a commission fee to save your own sinking ship." Spencer's hand dropped to his side. His smooth smile vanished instantly. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his tight collar. The realization that I saw right through his sophisticated corporate facade hit him hard. He realized that the patronizing approach was not going to work. He could not charm me, and he could not intimidate me with financial jargon. He slowly turned his head and looked at Alicia. She had stopped tending to my mother and was watching the interaction closely. They shared a very specific look. It was a dark, calculated glance that communicated a shared, desperate strategy. They had clearly planned for the possibility that I might cause a scene today, although they never could have predicted the magnitude of my actual wealth. They had prepared a contingency plan to put the pathetic little sister back in her place. Spencer turned back to me. His eyes were cold and dead. The benevolent brother-in-law act was officially over. "If you want to play hardball, Emily, we can play hardball," he said, his voice losing all of its fake warmth. He reached his right hand inside the breast pocket of his tailored white tuxedo jacket. His fingers grasped something hidden deep inside the lining. "You think you are so smart?" he sneered, pulling a folded document out of his pocket. "You think you can just walk in here, flaunt your new billions and humiliate us? But you forgot one very important detail about how you started that little company of yours." Alicia stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband. The fear in her eyes was completely replaced by a venomous, triumphant glare. She looked like a predator that had just cornered its prey. "Show it to her, Spencer," Alicia demanded, her voice trembling with malicious excitement. "Show our billionaire sister exactly who really owns Omnicart." Spencer held the folded piece of paper tightly in his hand, his knuckles turning white. The guests around us leaned in closer, holding their breath as the real war was finally about to begin. Spencer slowly handed the folded piece of paper to Alicia. He stepped back and let his wife take the corporate lead. Alicia was a lawyer, and this was her domain. She took the paper with both hands and carefully unfolded it. The paper was old and deeply creased. It looked like a piece of garbage that had been dug out of a recycling bin. But Alicia held it up like it was the most valuable historical document in the world. She smoothed out the wrinkled edges and cleared her throat. She looked at the crowd, making sure every single person in the massive ballroom was paying attention to her. "8 years ago, you were sitting in our kitchen, crying about how you could not afford to keep your little website running," Alicia said, her voice echoing across the silent room. "You had dropped out of college and you were begging our mother for help. Do you remember that, Emily? Do you remember how pathetic you looked sitting there asking for a family handout?" I remembered that day perfectly, but it did not happen the way Alicia was describing it at all. I had not been crying and I had not been begging. I was simply explaining my business model to my grandfather, who happened to be visiting our house that afternoon. My mother had interrupted the conversation and aggressively pushed a check for $5,000 across the kitchen island. She told me to take the money and stop embarrassing the family with my constant hustle. She then shoved a piece of notebook paper in front of me and demanded that I sign it. She called it a receipt, just in case I tried to say she never gave me anything. I was so exhausted from working multiple jobs that I signed the ridiculous paper just to make her stop yelling at me. Alicia held the paper higher so the guests could see the faded blue ink. "Our mother gave you $5,000 to save your failing business." Alicia continued, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "And being the smart businesswoman that she is, she did not just give you a gift. She made an investment. She had you sign a contract." My mother, who had been cowering in fear just moments ago, suddenly straightened her posture. The promise of billions of dollars washed away all of her shame and humiliation. She wiped the tears off her face and lifted her chin proudly. She looked around the room as if she was a brilliant venture capitalist who had just executed the financial trade of the century. "That is right," my mother said loudly. "I always knew it was a smart investment. I provided the seed capital for Omnicart. Without my money, that company would not even exist today." The sheer delusion was almost painful to witness. $5,000 was a fraction of what she had stolen from my college fund. But in their minds, this flimsy piece of notebook paper was their golden ticket. "Let me read what this contract says," Alicia announced, looking down at the faded ink. It says, I, Emily Johnson, hereby accept $5,000 from Vivian Johnson as a family equity investment in my online retail project. It is signed and dated by you, Emily. And underneath your signature, it clearly states that this equity investment represents a 30% ownership stake in the company. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. 30% of a $15 billion company was an astronomical sum. The Wall Street executives at the neighboring tables started whispering rapidly to each other. They knew that handwritten contracts were often flimsy, but in corporate law, early seed investments were incredibly dangerous territory. If a founder signed away equity early on without proper legal counsel, it could absolutely destroy them later. Alicia lowered the paper and smiled at me. It was a cold, predatory smile. I am a lawyer, Emily, she said smoothly. I know exactly how these things work. Under state law, this is a legally binding document. It shows a clear exchange of capital for equity. It does not matter that it was written on notebook paper. It does not matter that it was 8 years ago. What matters is your signature. You signed away 30% of Omnicart to this family. Spencer stepped forward again, standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. Let us do some simple math. Emily, he said, his voice filled with arrogant confidence. 30% of $15.8 billion is $4.74 billion. That is what you owe this family. That is our share of the company you built with our seed capital. The room was spinning with the magnitude of that number. $4.7 billion. It was enough money to buy private islands and sports teams. It was enough money to completely erase Spencer's financial failures and elevate Alicia to the highest ranks of the global elite. They were looking at me like I was a human bank vault, and they had just found the secret combination. I looked at the crumpled piece of notebook paper in Alicia's hand. I did not flinch. I did not show an ounce of fear. I just stared at the faded blue ink. I remembered the exact pen my mother had used. It was a cheap promotional pen from a local real estate agency. I remembered the smell of the kitchen and the smug look on my mother's face when she snatched the paper away from me. She had shoved it into a drawer and laughed, calling it her retirement plan. It was a sick joke to her, a way to hold something over my head and mock my ambition. You think a piece of notebook paper entitles you to $4 billion? I asked, my voice steady and unwavering. I do not think it, Emily, I know it. Alicia fired back, her eyes flashing with pure greed. I have already consulted with the senior partners at my law firm. They have reviewed copies of this document. They are fully prepared to take this to federal court. We will file a lawsuit so fast it will make your head spin. She took a step closer to me, waving the paper in the air. You went public today, Emily, she said, lowering her voice, so only the people at the head table could hear the real threat. Your shareholders are expecting stability. If we file a multi-billion-dollar ownership dispute tomorrow morning, your stock price will absolutely tank. The media will tear you apart. The board of directors will panic. Your entire $15 billion empire will be frozen in litigation for the next decade. Spencer crossed his arms and nodded in agreement. We can ruin you, Emily, he whispered. We can tie up every single asset you have. You will not be able to sell a single share. You will be a billionaire on paper, but you will not be able to touch a dime of it until we get our cut. My mother stepped up beside them, completing the hostile wall of family members. We just want what is fair, Emily, she said, her voice adopting that fake sweet tone again. We gave you the money when you needed it. Now it is time for you to pay us back. Do not make this ugly. Just honor the contract and give us our share. I stood alone facing the three of them. They were completely united in their greed. They had planned this ambush perfectly. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought they were holding a loaded gun to the head of my company. They expected me to crumble under the pressure of a massive corporate lawsuit. They expected me to beg for a settlement to protect my newly public company. But they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was still the scared 24-year-old girl sitting in their kitchen. They did not understand that over the past 8 years I had become a corporate apex predator. And I had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. I looked at Alicia and let her revel in her temporary delusion of power. She straightened her posture and adjusted the intricate lace bodice of her expensive designer wedding gown. She desperately wanted to play the role of the high-powered corporate attorney, taking down a massive tech giant. In her mind, she was the brilliant legal strategist, and I was just the dumb little sister who had gotten lucky on the internet. Let me explain exactly how this is going to work, Emily. Alicia said, her voice sharp and incredibly clinical. First thing Monday morning, my senior partners and I will file an emergency injunction in the Federal District Court in Manhattan. We will present this signed contract to the judge and claim that you committed massive securities fraud by failing to disclose a 30% equity stakeholder before taking your company public. The wealthy guests in the room were dead silent. They were hanging on every single word of her vicious legal threat. Alicia paced slowly back and forth in front of the head table, completely enjoying her captive audience. She loved the sound of her own voice, especially when she was using it to inflict pain. The federal judge will immediately grant a temporary restraining order, she continued, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. Your stock trading will be halted immediately. The Securities and Exchange Commission will launch a full-blown federal investigation into your corporate financial disclosures. Every single personal and business asset you own will be completely frozen by the government. You will not be able to sell or transfer a single share of Omnicart. Your board of directors will absolutely panic, and they will force you to step down as chief executive officer pending the results of the litigation. She stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, leaning in incredibly close. I could smell the expensive champagne on her breath mixed with her bitter jealousy. I will drag this out in the discovery phase for the next 5 years, Emily, she whispered harshly. I will depose every single person who works for you. I will demand access to all of your proprietary algorithms. I will bury your entire company in astronomical legal fees and terrible public relations until your precious $15 billion valuation is worth absolutely nothing. You will be completely ruined. Spencer stepped up right behind her, placing a heavy, supportive hand on her bare shoulder. But we are not monsters, Emily, he said, his voice perfectly smooth and calculated. We are your family. We do not actually want to destroy everything you have worked so hard to build. We just want to reach a reasonable and equitable out-of-court settlement. I stared at him, waiting for the massive extortion demand I knew was coming. He was a predator circling what he thought was a wounded animal. He honestly believed he was the smartest person in the room and that his Ivy League education made him untouchable. I will make this very simple for you, Spencer said, his pale blue eyes locking intensely onto mine. You are going to wire $500 million into the primary holding offshore account of Vanguard Horizon. We will draft an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a clean settlement contract classifying the massive payment as a retroactive family advisory fee and a generous wedding gift. Once the money clears our account, Alicia will hand over the original notebook paper and we will walk away forever. You get to keep your tech empire, and we get our fair share of the profits. $500 million. The sheer audacity of the number hung in the heavy air of the ballroom like a thick, toxic fog. It was a blatant extortion attempt on a massive corporate scale, and it was happening right in the middle of a wedding reception, in front of federal judges and Wall Street bankers. It was a masterclass in criminal arrogance. My mother stepped forward again, her eyes wide with desperate, greedy anticipation. Just do it, Emily, she pleaded frantically. 500 million is absolutely nothing to you now. It is just a tiny drop in the bucket compared to $15 billion. You can easily afford it. Just pay your sister and her new husband what they deserve, and we can put all of this ugly business behind us. You can go back to your rich life in the city, and we can finally have some peace. She was treating $500 million like it was a $20 bill I owed her for a cheap lunch. The profound ignorance of how corporate finance actually worked was staggering. They honestly thought I could just open a banking application on my phone and casually wire hundreds of millions of dollars of newly public equity as a wedding gift without triggering a massive federal audit and an immediate insider trading investigation. But I knew this was not just about ignorance. It was about Spencer's complete and utter desperation. $500 million was a very specific number. It was not a random fraction of my new wealth. It was the exact amount he needed to save his own miserable life. I looked at the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid wall of toxic family loyalty. The golden child sister, the manipulative, greedy mother, and the fraudulent brother-in-law. They genuinely thought they were holding all the winning cards. They thought my calm silence was the sound of my total submission. They thought I was paralyzed by the fear of losing my life's work to a drawn-out legal battle. "You want $500 million by Monday morning?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly and clearly in the quiet ballroom. "That is the price of family loyalty," Spencer replied with a smug, arrogant nod. "Consider it an investment in your own peace of mind. If the wire transfer does not hit my account by 9 o'clock on Monday morning, Alicia files the legal paperwork, and your entire empire burns to the ground. It is your choice, Emily. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way." I looked down at the table. I picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water and took a slow, methodical sip. I let the heavy silence stretch out for several long seconds, making them sweat just a little bit more. I could see the nervous, desperate anticipation vibrating in Alicia's hands. She wanted me to break down crying right there in front of her friends. She wanted me to beg for mercy and agree to their ridiculous terms. Instead, I slowly placed the crystal glass back down on the white tablecloth. I looked up at the three of them and gave them a soft, chilling smile. My chilling smile did not have the effect on my mother that it had on Spencer and Alicia. Vivian was a master of emotional manipulation, and she knew that threats alone would not break me. She saw the coldness in my eyes and instantly changed her entire strategy. She pushed past Spencer and stood directly in front of me, blocking my view of the rest of the ballroom. She clasped her hands together tightly and let her shoulders drop. Her face contorted into a mask of pure maternal agony. She was about to deliver the performance of a lifetime for the benefit of Spencer's incredibly wealthy white relatives sitting at the tables surrounding us. "Emily, look at what you are doing to us," my mother whispered loudly enough for the entire front row of guests to hear. "Look around you. Half of the people in this room are the Montgomery family. They are old money. They are respectable people. And you are standing here humiliating your own flesh and blood in front of them on the most important day of your sister's life. Is this really the person you have become? Has all this money turned your heart completely to stone?" I kept my expression entirely neutral, but internally I was analyzing every single word she used. She was weaponizing family loyalty to protect her fragile social standing. She did not care about my feelings, or the fact that her son-in-law was attempting to extort $500 million from me. She only cared about how this messy public confrontation looked to the elite white guests she was so desperately trying to impress. $500 million is nothing to you now, Emily," she pleaded, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured tears. "It is just a tiny fraction of your new wealth. You have $15 billion. You have more money than anyone in this room could ever spend in 10 lifetimes, and yet you are willing to let your sister be dragged through federal court. You are willing to let our family be destroyed over what is essentially pocket change to you. How can you be so incredibly heartless?" She reached out and placed her cold hands on my arms. I did not pull away. I let her play her part. "We are a family, Emily," she continued, her voice breaking at precisely the right moments. "We are a Black family trying to survive and thrive in a world that is designed to keep us out. We have to stick together. We have to share our blessings. Your sister worked so hard to get here to marry into this world, and Spencer is trying to help you. He is offering to protect your assets and manage your wealth. He is treating you like a real sister." The gaslighting was so dense I could almost feel it suffocating the air around me. She was actually trying to convince me that an aggressive legal threat and a multi-million-dollar extortion demand was an act of brotherly love. She was spinning their profound greed into a narrative of family unity and racial solidarity. It was a disgusting manipulation of our shared history. Think about the legacy you want to leave, my mother whispered, leaning closer so her expensive perfume completely overwhelmed my senses. Do you want to be remembered as the ruthless billionaire who ruined her sister's wedding and abandoned her family out of pure greed? Or do you want to be the generous savior who elevated all of us? Just give them the money, Emily. Wire the funds to Spencer's account and let us be a happy family. Do not let your pride destroy the only people in this world who truly share your blood. If you walk away from us today, you will be entirely alone in that big, empty corporate world. Alicia stood behind our mother, nodding in solemn agreement. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk tissue, playing the part of the traumatized bride perfectly. Spencer stood tall beside them, looking like the patient, reasonable patriarch, waiting for the difficult child to finally fall in line. They were a united front of absolute toxicity. They had built a psychological trap designed to crush my boundaries and drain my bank accounts for the rest of my natural life. I listened to the soft classical music that had slowly started playing again in the background. The string quartet was trying to cover up the awkward tension in the room. I looked at the faces of the Montgomery family sitting at the tables nearby. They were watching the drama unfold with polite disgust. They clearly viewed my family as chaotic new money social climbers. My mother was completely oblivious to their judgment. She was too focused on securing the bag. The heavy silence stretched out between us. My mother squeezed my arms, gently urging me to submit. Alicia let out a soft, pathetic sigh. Spencer crossed his arms and waited for his ultimate victory. They had used every weapon in their arsenal. They had used legal threats, financial intimidation, social pressure, and maternal guilt. They had thrown everything they had at me in one massive coordinated attack. I slowly let out a long breath. I allowed my shoulders to drop just a fraction of an inch. I blinked slowly and directed my gaze downward, entirely breaking eye contact with my mother. I stared at the pristine white tablecloth. I let my hands fall limply to my sides. I stood there in complete silence, looking utterly defeated. The physical shift in my posture sent an immediate shockwave of relief through my family. I could hear my mother let out a massive breath, the tension completely drained from her body. She patted my arm affectionately and took a step back. Alicia lowered her silk tissue and smiled a genuine vicious smile of absolute triumph. She looked at Spencer and gave him a tiny confirming nod. He smirked proudly. I kept my eyes focused on the pristine white tablecloth for exactly 10 seconds. I counted them out in my head, allowing the silence to perfectly cement their false sense of victory. I could hear the subtle rustle of Alicia's heavy wedding gown as she relaxed her aggressive stance. I could hear Spencer let out a quiet breath through his nose, a sound of pure, arrogant satisfaction. They had won. That was the narrative playing out in their minds. They had successfully broken the billionaire. They had secured their financial future through brute force and emotional terrorism. I slowly raised my head. The movement was smooth and entirely calculated. When my eyes finally met Spencer's, the smug smirk on his face faltered for just a fraction of a second. He was expecting to see tears. He was expecting to see the defeated, trembling eyes of a woman who had just surrendered $500 million. Instead, he saw nothing but absolute predatory calm. I smiled at him. It was not a warm smile, and it was certainly not a smile of submission. It was the chilling, empty smile of a corporate executioner who had just locked the doors to the slaughterhouse. The temperature at the head table seemed to plummet. My mother took another step back, her maternal act instantly evaporating. Alicia stopped dabbing her eyes and stared at me with sudden, intense uncertainty. The power dynamic in the room had just violently shifted, and they did not understand how or why. I had not said a single word, but the raw authority radiating from my posture made them suddenly feel incredibly small. Spencer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to maintain his dominant stance. "So, Do we have an agreement, Emily? He asked, his voice losing just a trace of its previous absolute certainty. You will authorize the wire transfer on Monday morning, and we can all move forward as a united family. I did not answer his question. I completely ignored the extortion demand as if he had just offered me a glass of tap water. Instead, I tilted my head slightly and focused entirely on him. Tell me about Vanguard Horizon, Spencer? I said, my voice perfectly conversational and light. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden change in subject. Excuse me, he asked. Your investment fund, I clarified, leaning forward just an inch. You mentioned earlier that you manage portfolios for some of the oldest families in the country. You said you know how to navigate market volatility and shield assets. I am just curious. How is the fund performing lately? It has been a very unpredictable quarter for the financial sector. Spencer stared at me, his mind racing. He was trying to figure out if this was a trap, or if I was genuinely considering him for a larger role in my financial future. His massive ego quickly made the decision for him. He assumed my question was a sign of total surrender. He thought I was vetting him, testing his financial acumen, before handing over the $500 million. He could not resist the opportunity to brag in front of the wealthy guests, who were still actively listening to our every word. Vanguard Horizon is performing exceptionally well, he said, puffing out his chest and adjusting his expensive silk tie. We are actually having one of our most profitable fiscal years on record. My team and I have developed a proprietary algorithm for identifying undervalued assets in emerging markets. Our year-over-year returns have consistently outperformed the standard index by at least 12%. That is incredibly impressive, I said, nodding slowly. Consistently beating the market by 12% is almost unheard of in this current economic climate. Your high net worth clients must be absolutely thrilled with those returns. They are beyond thrilled, Spencer boasted, his voice growing louder and more confident. We have a wait list of investors trying to get their capital into our primary fund. We turn away more money than we accept, Emily. We only work with the absolute best. We provide complete financial security and total transparency for our partners. It is a bulletproof institution. Alicia smiled proudly, looking around the room to make sure the Wall Street executives at the neighboring tables were hearing her husband's incredible success story. She wanted them to know she had married a titan of industry. My mother nodded along, pretending she understood the complex financial jargon Spencer was throwing around. Total transparency. I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue slowly. That is a very strong promise to make in the world of private equity, Spencer. So you are saying your fund is highly liquid. If your clients wanted to withdraw their capital tomorrow, Vanguard Horizon would have absolutely no problem clearing those transactions. Spencer laughed. It was a deep, arrogant sound. Liquidity is never an issue for a properly managed fund, Emily, he said, taking a step closer to me. We maintain massive cash reserves specifically to handle any sudden market fluctuations. Vanguard Horizon is a fortress. That is exactly why you need me to handle your new wealth. I know how to build a fortress around your money, so nobody can ever touch it. I looked deeply into his pale blue eyes. I studied the microscopic tightening of the muscles around his jaw. I noticed the tiny bead of sweat forming right at his hairline despite the heavy air conditioning in the massive ballroom. He was a very good liar. He had practiced this pitch hundreds of times. But I had spent the last 8 years building artificial intelligence systems designed to detect micro-anomalies in behavioral data. I could read a human being just as easily as I could read a line of code. He was terrified. He was standing on a trapdoor, and he had just gleefully handed me the lever. A fortress. I said, my voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper. That is a very beautiful lie, Spencer. His arrogant laugh died instantly in his throat. What did you just say? He demanded, his face turning an angry shade of red. I said, it is a beautiful lie, I repeated, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. And I think it is time we show everyone exactly what your fortress is actually built on. I did not wait for his response. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Spencer. I slowly raised my right hand into the air. The ballroom was so quiet that every single guest was watching my movement. I held my hand up for just a second, suspended in the heavy tension of the room. And then I simply snapped my fingers. The sharp cracking sound echoed loudly across the elegant ballroom, cutting through the soft classical music like a gunshot. The sharp cracking sound of my fingers snapping echoed loudly across the elegant ballroom, cutting through the soft classical music like a gunshot. For one long, agonizing second, absolutely nothing happened. Spencer let out a short, nervous breath, thinking that my dramatic gesture was nothing but an empty bluff. He opened his mouth to say something, probably another patronizing comment about how I was overreacting. But before a single word could escape his lips, the massive, solid oak double doors at the far end of the banquet hall suddenly swung open with a heavy, violent thud. The sound was so loud that several guests near the entrance physically jumped out of their seats. The soft, warm lighting of the ballroom spilled out into the dark hallway, revealing a line of silhouettes standing perfectly still in the entryway. The string quartet, which had been desperately trying to maintain an atmosphere of romantic elegance, completely stopped playing mid-note. The lead cellist slowly lowered his bow, staring at the doors in utter confusion. The waiters who were carrying silver trays of expensive champagne froze in their tracks. Every single pair of eyes in the room turned away from the head table and looked toward the entrance. What they saw completely shattered the carefully curated illusion of Alicia's high society wedding. It was not late-arriving guests or hotel management. It was my elite corporate legal team. 10 men and women marched through the large oak doors in perfect unison. They were not dressed for a summer wedding in the Hamptons. They wore razor-sharp, dark-tailored suits that screamed corporate warfare. There were no pastel colors, no floral ties, and no polite smiles. Their faces were entirely devoid of emotion. They looked like a tactical military unit, but instead of assault rifles, they carried heavy black leather briefcases packed with damning financial evidence. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The warm, joyful vibe of a marital celebration was completely sucked out of the air and replaced by the cold, sterile hostility of a high-stakes corporate boardroom. Leading the group was Jonathan, my chief legal counsel. Jonathan was a ruthless, brilliant attorney who had built his reputation by absolutely destroying hostile takeovers and dismantling fraudulent corporate structures. He walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man who held the power to freeze bank accounts and ruin lives with a single signature. He did not look at the expensive floral arrangements or the towering 5-tier wedding cake. He did not care about the flashing cameras or the gasping guests. His dark eyes were locked entirely on the head table, specifically targeting the pale, trembling face of my new brother-in-law. The crowd of wealthy guests instinctively parted, like the Red Sea, as Jonathan and his team marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. The Wall Street executives at the neighboring tables immediately recognized the shift in power. They knew what elite corporate lawyers looked like when they were on the hunt. The whispers that rippled through the room were no longer about my $15 billion net worth. They were sharp, nervous murmurs of genuine corporate panic. Wealthy people understood that when an army of suits crashed a private event, somebody was about to lose everything they had. I watched the color completely drain from Spencer's face. He took a small, involuntary step backward, putting physical distance between himself and the approaching legal team. His arrogant posture collapsed. He suddenly looked incredibly small and insignificant standing there in his white tuxedo. He had spent the last 20 minutes acting like an untouchable financial genius, but now the real predators had entered the room. He realized in that terrifying moment that I had not come to his wedding to be extorted. I had come to execute a hostile takeover of his entire life. Alicia frantically looked back and forth between me and the army of lawyers marching toward her. She grabbed the heavy fabric of her expensive designer wedding gown, pulling it tightly around her legs, as if the silk and lace could somehow protect her from the impending legal slaughter. Her dream wedding was being methodically dismantled right in front of her eyes. She turned to Spencer, expecting him to do something to take control of the situation, to be the wealthy, powerful patriarch he claimed to be. But Spencer was completely paralyzed. His pale blue eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. My mother Vivian retreated until her back hit the edge of the head table. She bumped into a tall crystal vase, sending a dozen white roses spilling onto the marble floor. She did not even notice. She stared at the lawyers with her mouth hanging open, completely unable to process how her manipulative plan had gone so horribly wrong. She had thought she could bully me into compliance by using family guilt and the pressure of a public setting. She never imagined that I would gladly turn her precious social event into a public execution. Jonathan reached the head table. He did not say "excuse me" to the guests who had scrambled out of his way. He stopped right in front of Spencer, forcing the taller man to look down at him. Jonathan did not smile. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket and placed his heavy black leather briefcase squarely on the pristine white tablecloth right next to Alicia's discarded crystal champagne glass. The rest of the legal team fanned out, forming a solid, intimidating wall of dark suits directly behind my chair. They stood shoulder to shoulder, effectively blocking my family from getting anywhere near me. The loud metallic click of Jonathan's briefcase unlocking sounded like a guillotine dropping in the silent ballroom. He opened the leather lid, revealing stacks of neatly organized financial documents printed on thick legal paper. These were not flimsy pieces of notebook paper with faded blue ink. These were certified bank records, federal court filings, and proprietary forensic accounting reports. Jonathan reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick, perfectly bound dossier. He did not hand it to Spencer. He simply dropped it onto the table with a heavy, commanding thud. "Good evening, Emily." Jonathan said, his voice deep and authoritative, cutting through the suffocating tension in the room. His tone was perfectly respectful, treating me not as a younger sister or a family outcast, but as the $15 billion chief executive officer that I was. "I apologize for the interruption," he continued, ignoring the terrified family standing mere inches away from him. "We have compiled the complete forensic audit of Vanguard Horizon just as you requested. The document trail is incredibly thorough. We are fully prepared to proceed with the asset seizure and the federal disclosures whenever you give the order." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on Spencer's rapidly crumbling facade. "Thank you, Jonathan," I replied, my voice calm and completely in control. "The timing is actually perfect. My brother-in-law was just telling us all about the incredible fortress he built around his investment fund. He was just explaining how his massive cash reserves provide total financial security. I think it would be incredibly educational for everyone here to see exactly what that fortress looks like from the inside." I reached out and placed my hand flat on the thick leather-bound dossier that Jonathan had dropped on the table. Spencer took another step back, his chest heaving under his custom white tuxedo. I opened the heavy cover and slid the first stack of documents across the white tablecloth directly toward him. "Look at it, Spencer," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. He refused to look down at the papers. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if praying for a miracle that was never going to come. I turned my attention away from him and looked out at the wealthy guests, specifically targeting the Montgomery family sitting at the front tables. "My brother-in-law has been telling all of you that his fund is outperforming the market by 12%, I said, projecting my voice clearly across the dead silent ballroom. "He told you he turns away investors because he is so incredibly successful. But certified corporate records tell a very different story. 6 months ago, Vanguard Horizon suffered a catastrophic series of margin calls. The proprietary algorithm he was just bragging about was completely flawed. It was nothing but a house of cards. It wiped out over $400 million of client capital in less than 72 hours. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several Wall Street executives immediately started pulling out their phones, frantically checking their own financial exposure to his fund. The air in the room grew thick with genuine panic. Spencer tried to speak, but his voice cracked pathetically. "That is confidential financial information," he stammered, his face a mask of pure terror. You are violating corporate privacy laws, Emily. You cannot show those documents to these people. I did not stop my relentless assault. If it was just a bad trade, that would be one thing. I continued walking slowly around the head table, so there was absolutely nothing standing between me and him. The stock market is volatile and massive losses happen every single day. But you did not report the losses to your clients, did you, Spencer? Instead, you forged the quarterly statements. You created completely fabricated yield reports and sent them out to your high net worth investors to make them think their money was still safe and growing. You transformed a failing hedge fund into a massive criminal fraud. Alicia grabbed Spencer's arm, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief. Spencer, tell her to shut up. Alicia pleaded, her voice shrill and desperate. Tell them she is lying. Tell them our money is fine and this is just a terrible misunderstanding. Spencer could not even look at his new wife. He was staring at the marble floor, completely broken and exposed. It gets much worse, Alicia, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still somehow carried across the silent room. He did not just hide the massive market losses. He started stealing the remaining capital. He embezzled tens of millions of dollars from his clients' trust accounts to maintain his illusion of massive wealth. He used stolen money to buy his custom-tailored suits, his luxury cars, and the expensive jewelry he bought to impress you and our mother. He even used stolen client funds to rent this lavish Hamptons estate and pay for this ridiculous $500,000 wedding. The guests were absolutely horrified. Several people from his side of the family stood up from their chairs, looking disgusted and completely furious. The illusion of the wealthy, aristocratic Montgomery family was being burned to ashes right in front of their eyes. You are standing here in a stolen tuxedo, drinking stolen champagne, trying to act like you are somehow better than me, I said, taking one final step toward him. And that brings us to your highly generous settlement offer. $500 million. It sounded like such a random, massive number when you demanded it just a few minutes ago. But forensic accounting is a very beautiful and exact science, Spencer. Jonathan and my legal team audited your shadow accounts last week. $500 million is the exact amount of money missing from the Vanguard Horizon primary ledger. It is the exact amount of money you need to replace before the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission conducts their mandatory annual audit on Tuesday morning. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail and slumped into an empty chair, holding her head in her trembling hands. The reality of the situation finally pierced through her dense layer of social climbing delusion. You did not want a family partnership, Spencer, I declared, pointing a finger directly at his chest. You did not want to protect my new wealth from corporate raiders. You were trying to extort me to save yourself from federal prison. You knew your entire fake empire was about to collapse, and you saw my initial public offering as your miraculous way out. You planned to use that flimsy piece of notebook paper to hold my $15 billion company hostage until I paid your ransom. You thought I would be so terrified of a public scandal that I would just wire you $500 million to make you go away. Spencer finally looked up at me. His pale blue eyes were bloodshot and filled with tears of absolute desperation. The arrogant finance bro was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal begging for his life. Please, Emily, he whispered, his voice breaking completely. Please do not do this to me. You have the money. You can save us. If the federal agents look at those books, my life is completely over. I will go to federal prison for 20 years. I will lose everything I have ever worked for. I looked at the pathetic man begging for mercy in front of hundreds of people. He had spent his entire life looking down on people like me. He had used his white privilege and his fake wealth to make my own family worship him. He had tried to steal the company I built with my own bare hands. And now he was crying like a child, asking me to become a co-conspirator in his massive financial crime. You already lost everything, Spencer, I replied, my voice as cold as absolute zero. You lost it 6 months ago when you decided to steal from your clients. I am simply the person delivering the final receipt. I turned to Jonathan, who was standing tall and imposing beside the head table. Jonathan, please distribute copies of the forensic audit to the Montgomery family and any Vanguard Horizon investors currently in the room, I instructed. I think they have a right to know exactly where their hard-earned money went. Jonathan nodded sharply and opened the second massive leather briefcase. His elite legal team immediately began handing out thick packets of damning financial evidence to the horrified guests. The elegant ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. I watched the chaos unfold for a few seconds before turning my attention to the bride. Alicia was standing completely frozen next to her crumbling husband. Her perfect world was disintegrating right in front of her. The wealthy friends she had spent years trying to impress were now looking at her with absolute disgust. Some of them were already marching toward the exit, throwing the thick financial packets onto the tables in anger. Alicia snapped out of her shocked trance and immediately went into self-preservation mode. She stepped away from Spencer, putting physical distance between herself and the man she had just married. She looked at me and then looked out at the remaining guests. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. I had nothing to do with this. Emily, she shouted, her voice echoing above the panicked murmurs of the crowd. I am a victim here just like everyone else. I did not know anything about his failing fund or his stolen money. I am a lawyer. I would never involve myself in corporate fraud. He lied to me. He used me. You have to believe me, Emily. I am completely innocent in all of this. She was trying to save her own reputation by throwing Spencer directly under the bus. It was a classic Alicia move. Whenever things went wrong, she always found a way to make herself the victim. But I was not going to let her rewrite history today. You are not a victim, Alicia, I said calmly, stepping closer to her. You are a willing accomplice to your own destruction. You were so blinded by your desperate desire to marry a wealthy white man that you ignored every single red flag. You wanted the country club memberships and the Hamptons estate so badly that you never bothered to ask how a 37-year-old hedge fund manager was magically funding a billionaire lifestyle on a mediocre portfolio. I did not know, she repeated, shaking her head furiously. He told me his algorithms were flawless. He told me we were incredibly rich. I just signed the marriage papers today. I am not legally responsible for his corporate crimes. I can file for an annulment tomorrow morning. I actually felt a tiny flicker of genuine pity for her in that moment. Her prestigious law degree was completely useless against the reality of her own profound ignorance. She honestly thought she could just walk away from this disaster with her hands completely clean. You are right about one thing, Alicia, I replied, nodding slowly. You are not legally responsible for the crimes he committed before the wedding, but you are absolutely responsible for the documents you signed to help him cover up those crimes. Alicia stopped shaking her head. The frantic energy drained out of her body, replaced by a sudden chilling stillness. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. What documents? I turned back to the table and picked up another file from the thick dossier Jonathan had provided. I held it up so she could clearly see the bright red foreclosure stamp on the front page. 3 months ago, Spencer realized he was completely out of cash. I explained, projecting my voice so my mother could hear every single word. The margin calls were destroying his fund, and the federal auditors were starting to ask very uncomfortable questions. He needed liquidity immediately to keep the Ponzi scheme afloat, but his personal assets were already heavily leveraged. He needed collateral, clean collateral. I looked past Alicia and locked eyes with my mother. Vivian was still slumped in her chair, but she was staring at me with a look of pure dread. 5 years ago, Mother, you transferred the deed of your primary residence into Alicia's name, I said, stating the historical facts clearly. You did it to shield the house from your own mounting credit card debts. You wanted to make sure the bank could not take your home. You trusted your golden child to protect your most valuable asset. My mother let out a tiny, pathetic whimper. She knew exactly where this was going. Alicia, you own that house free and clear. I continued, turning my attention back to the terrified bride, which made it the perfect piece of collateral for a desperate man. 2 months ago, Spencer asked you to sign a stack of legal documents. He probably told you it was routine paperwork for the wedding or some complex tax strategy for his fund. And because you were so desperate to secure your wealthy husband, you did not even bother to read what you were signing. Alicia looked at Spencer, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Spencer could not even look at her. He kept his head down, staring at his expensive leather shoes. "Tell me what I signed," Alicia demanded, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Emily, tell me what he made me sign." "You signed a secondary mortgage agreement?" I said, dropping the heavy file onto the table right in front of her. "You authorized a high-interest bridge loan using our mother's house as the primary collateral." Spencer took that money and immediately dumped it into his failing fund, trying to cover his massive losses. But it was not enough. The fund continued to bleed cash. And because Spencer has not made a single payment on that bridge loan, the private lending company has officially initiated foreclosure proceedings. Alicia let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She lunged forward and grabbed the file off the table, flipping frantically through the pages. She saw her own signature neatly written in black ink at the bottom of the loan agreement. She saw the astronomical interest rates and the completely devastating default clauses. "You owe $15 million, Alicia," I stated the exact figure with cold precision. "That is the current balance of the bridge loan, including penalties and default fees. You are the sole guarantor on that debt. When the lending company forecloses on the house next week, it will not even come close to covering the principal balance. They will liquidate the property, and then they will come after you for the rest." My mother let out a loud, agonizing scream. "My house!" she wailed, rocking back and forth in her chair. "My beautiful house! You gave away my house, Alicia. How could you do this to me? Where am I going to live?" Alicia dropped the file onto the marble floor. She stared at her hands as if they were covered in blood. The realization of her absolute ruin crashed over her like a massive tidal wave. She was no longer the wealthy corporate lawyer married to a Wall Street titan. She was a deeply indebted fraud who had just rendered her own mother completely homeless. Her entire identity was built on being the superior sibling. She had spent her whole life looking down on me, calling me a failure and a disappointment. She had mocked my online business and laughed at my struggles. She had stood on that very podium just an hour ago and publicly humiliated me in front of 300 people. And now the golden child was completely shattered. She was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt, while the sister she had relentlessly bullied stood in front of her as a $15 billion titan of industry. "You thought you were marrying into the elite, Alicia?" I said, my voice soft but incredibly firm. "You thought Spencer was your golden ticket to a life of luxury and privilege. But he was just a parasite, and you were so desperate for the illusion of success that you let him drain you dry." She sank to her knees right there in her expensive custom designer gown. The heavy silk and lace pooled around her on the cold marble floor. She covered her face with her hands and began to weep uncontrollably. It was not the fake, theatrical crying she usually deployed to get her way. It was the ugly, agonizing sobbing of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything. I stood over her, feeling no remorse and no pity. She had made her choices. She had chosen greed over family. She had chosen status over integrity. And now she was going to pay the ultimate price. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by her pathetic weeping, and the sound of my mother's continued wailing. The destruction of their toxic empire was finally complete. I turned away from the sobbing bride and looked back at my mother. Vivian was still clutching her face, swaying back and forth in her chair. She was mourning the sudden loss of her house, but her greedy mind was still desperately clinging to one final life raft. She slowly looked up at me, her makeup running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. The notebook paper Alicia had been holding earlier was now lying on the table next to the heavy legal files. My mother reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the wrinkled piece of paper toward her chest. "You still owe us," she whispered, her voice shaking but stubborn. "The house might be gone, and Spencer might be a criminal, but this contract is still legally binding, Emily. You signed it. 30% of 15 billion is still ours. I gave you that $5,000. You have to pay me my share. If you just give me my money, I can buy a new house. I can fix all of this. Her delusion was truly staggering. Even after watching her son-in-law be exposed as a massive federal fraud and seeing her golden child completely ruined by debt, she still believed she was entitled to the fruits of my labor. She honestly thought that a faded piece of notebook paper was going to magically save her from the consequences of her own terrible choices. She was willing to ignore all the destruction around her if it meant she could still get her hands on my fortune. I walked over to the table and looked down at her. I did not try to snatch the paper away. I let her hold on to it. "I want to talk about that $5,000, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I want to talk about where exactly that money came from. Because as Alicia so helpfully pointed out earlier, you need a legitimate exchange of capital to create a legally binding equity contract." My mother blinked her eyes, darting nervously around the room. "It came from my savings," she stammered defensively. "I worked hard and saved that money for family emergencies. I sacrificed my own financial security to invest in your little project." I signaled to Jonathan, who was still standing at attention behind me. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single slim folder. He handed it to me, and I opened it slowly. Inside was a certified financial trace report from one of the largest banking institutions in the country. I placed the folder on the table right next to my mother's trembling hands. "You never had $5,000 in your savings account, Mother," I stated simply. "You were drowning in credit card debt. You were constantly moving money around just to keep the lights on and pay for Alicia's expensive designer clothes. But there was one account you had access to that actually had money in it. It was the trust fund Grandfather Theodore set up for me before he passed away." The mention of my grandfather's name made my mother physically flinch. The wealthy guests who had been preparing to leave suddenly stopped and turned back around. Stealing from a trust fund was a massive taboo in their circles. It was the kind of scandal that destroyed families for generations. Grandfather Theodore was a smart man. I continued projecting my voice so everyone could hear the final nail in her coffin. "He knew exactly what kind of person you were. He knew you obsessed over appearances and status. That is why he explicitly locked the trust fund, preventing you from withdrawing the principal balance. But you were the custodial trustee until I turned 25. You found a loophole. You realized you could request small emergency disbursements if you claimed they were for my direct educational or medical expenses." My mother stopped crying. Her face went completely blank. She stared at the certified banking report on the table. "8 years ago on a Tuesday morning, you went into the local bank branch," I said, reading the exact details from the forensic report. "You forged my signature on an emergency disbursement form claiming I needed $5,000 for emergency dental surgery. The bank approved the transfer and handed you a cashier's check. You took that exact same check, drove straight home, and shoved it across the kitchen island. You forced me to sign a piece of notebook paper claiming it was a family investment." I leaned down so my face was only inches away from hers. "You did not invest your own money in my company, Mother," I whispered harshly. "You stole my own money from my own trust fund and then tried to force me to give you 30% of my life's work in exchange for it." The ballroom erupted in a chorus of disgusted gasps. Stealing from your own child's trust fund was reprehensible, but using that stolen money to try and extort a multi-billion-dollar tech empire was a level of criminal audacity that left the Wall Street executives completely speechless. "That is a lie," my mother choked out, but her voice had absolutely no conviction. She was staring at the banking records, seeing the exact dates and the forged signatures completely exposed. "It is a certified bank trace, Mother," I replied, straightening my posture. "The paper you are holding right now is not an equity contract. It is a signed confession. You documented the exact date and amount of your theft. You proved that you took the disbursed funds and used them for an unauthorized corporate investment rather than the medical emergency you claimed on the bank forms. By trying to enforce this contract today, you just provided the federal government with undeniable proof of wire fraud and criminal theft by a fiduciary. I looked at Alicia, who was still kneeling on the floor, sobbing. And since your brilliant lawyer daughter just stood in front of 300 people and threatened to use that forged document to file a fraudulent injunction in federal court, she is now legally implicated in an extortion conspiracy. Alicia let out a fresh wail of pure agony, burying her face in her hands. She knew the legal implications immediately. She could be disbarred. She could face federal charges alongside her mother and her husband. The golden child was entirely trapped in a criminal web of their own making. My mother looked down at the crumpled notebook paper in her hands. The golden ticket that she thought would buy her mansions and yachts was actually a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. Her hands started shaking so violently that the paper fluttered to the floor, landing right next to Alicia's ruined wedding dress. "What are you going to do?" she whispered, her voice completely devoid of hope. "Are you going to send your own mother to prison?" I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to break me. I felt no anger anymore. I only felt a cold, sterile sense of justice. The statute of limitations for federal wire fraud involving a trust account is 10 years, I stated clearly, which means you are still well within the window for prosecution. Jonathan has already prepared the complete evidence package. Whether or not I send it to the district attorney depends entirely on what happens next. My mother stayed frozen in her chair, waiting for me to dictate her fate, but I was entirely finished with her. I turned my back on Vivian and walked slowly toward Spencer. He was leaning heavily against the edge of the head table. His expensive custom white tuxedo was wrinkled, and he was sweating profusely. He had just watched his wife crumble under massive debt and his mother-in-law face federal prosecution. He knew he was the final target. In the corporate world, a hostile takeover usually involves buying up enough shares to forcefully remove a failing executive board, I said, my voice projecting evenly across the quiet ballroom. It is a very clean and clinical process. But when you are dealing with a fraudulent hedge fund manager who tries to extort you, the mechanics become much more personal. Spencer swallowed hard. His throat was incredibly dry. He tried to stand up straight to reclaim some tiny fraction of his dignity, but his legs were visibly shaking. When Vanguard Horizon began to violently collapse, your institutional creditors started panicking, I explained, looking out at the wealthy guests who were hanging on my every word. They knew you were defaulting on your loans. They knew the money was gone. In those situations, banks are usually desperate to sell off the bad debt for pennies on the dollar just to clear their ledgers. They want to cut their losses and walk away. I stopped right in front of him. A month ago, I instructed Jonathan and my legal team to establish a highly insulated shell company called Apex Holdings, I said. It was completely untraceable to me or to Omnicart. And over the past 4 weeks, Apex Holdings has been very quietly approaching every single one of your creditors. Spencer's eyes widened as the realization began to dawn on him. He shook his head slowly, denying the terrifying reality. "We bought your massive commercial loans, Spencer," I continued relentlessly. "We bought the leases on your luxury cars. We bought the mortgages on your fake corporate office spaces. We bought the massive lines of credit you used to fund your entirely fraudulent lifestyle. We bought all of it." The Wall Street executives in the room let out low murmurs of absolute shock. They understood exactly what I had done. I had not just defeated him, I had completely consumed his financial existence. "I am not just your sister-in-law, Spencer," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper. "I am your sole remaining creditor. I own every single piece of debt attached to your name." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant finance brother who had tried to hand me a $5,000 charity loan just an hour ago was now realizing that I literally owned his entire life. "But the most interesting asset we acquired during this hostile takeover is actually right here," I said. I slowly raised my arms, gesturing outward to the massive crystal chandeliers, the towering marble columns, and the beautiful sprawling gardens visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. You told Alicia you rented this exclusive Hamptons estate for the entire weekend, I stated, walking slowly along the length of the head table. You told her family and your wealthy friends that it cost $500,000. You acted like you paid for it in cash because you were a traditional wealthy gentleman providing a fairy tale wedding for his beautiful bride. Alicia stopped her agonizing sobbing for just a moment. She looked up from the cold marble floor, her face completely ruined by tears and running makeup. She had spent months bragging to her friends about this specific venue. It was the crown jewel of her fake high society image. But you did not pay in cash. Spencer, I continued, turning to face him again. You do not have any cash. You financed this entire lavish event using a short-term corporate credit line from the Belmont Luxury Hospitality Group. You fraudulently used your failing fund as collateral to secure the venue, hoping you could extort the money from me before the bill came due. The guests from his side of the family were shaking their heads in absolute disgust. The illusion of his success was so thoroughly shattered that there was absolutely nothing left but the ugly, pathetic truth. The members of the Montgomery family who had spent the evening looking down their noses at my mother and sister were now completely silent. They realized they were sitting in a venue owned by a black female billionaire whom their golden boy had just tried to extort. The shame radiating from their tables was palpable. Several of them quietly stood up, gathering their coats and expensive purses, preparing to flee the scene of this massive social disaster. And since my shell company bought all of your outstanding corporate debt last week, we also acquired the defaulted collateral associated with those accounts, I explained, making sure every single syllable carried the weight of a corporate hammer. I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify my next words. I did not just crash your wedding, Spencer, I said, a cold, empty smile touching my lips. I am hosting it. My company legally purchased this property 3 days ago. I own the marble floor you are standing on. I own the chairs your guests are sitting in. I own the very roof over your head. The mic drop was absolute and devastating. The sheer magnitude of my financial retaliation hung in the air, pressing down on my toxic family until they could barely breathe. I had not just protected my $15 billion empire, I had weaponized it to completely annihilate their false reality. You tried to use a piece of notebook paper to steal my company? I said, staring deeply into his terrified, pale blue eyes. So I used my company to buy your entire life. And as the legal owner of this beautiful estate, I have to inform you that you are currently trespassing on my private property. Spencer stared at me, his mind completely breaking under the weight of his absolute defeat. He had absolutely nothing left. His money was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His freedom was about to be taken by the federal government. And the lavish venue he had rented to prove his superiority was actually owned by the woman he had tried to destroy. The arrogant white knight of the family was officially a penniless trespasser. You cannot do this to me, he finally whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. You cannot just buy my life, Emily. It is not legal. There are regulations. There are corporate protections. I laughed softly. It was a cold, humorless sound. There are protections for legitimate businesses, Spencer, I replied. There are no protections for fraudulent hedge funds that embezzle client capital to fund personal weddings. When you default on your loans, the creditors have the right to sell the debt. And I had the capital to buy it. It is perfectly legal and it is entirely binding. Alicia let out another agonizing wail. She realized that she had just married a man who did not even own the tuxedo he was wearing. She was legally bound to a criminal who had literally nothing to his name except massive federal liabilities. She looked at the towering 5-tier wedding cake, the extravagant floral centerpieces, and the crystal champagne glasses. They were all paid for by me. Her entire dream wedding was nothing but a charity event funded by the sister she despised. This is not fair, my mother cried out from her chair, her voice thick with absolute despair. You planned this, Emily. You planned to humiliate us in front of all these important people. You wanted to destroy us. I did not plan your greed, Mother, I said without even turning to look at her. I simply prepared for it. You all made your choices. You chose to steal from my trust fund. Alicia chose to mortgage your house. Spencer chose to embezzle millions and try to extort me for $500 million more. I did not force any of you to commit those crimes. I simply bought the receipts. I took a step back, surveying the absolute wreckage of my toxic family. They were broken, weeping, and entirely defeated. The hostile takeover was complete. I had protected my legacy and completely dismantled theirs. I stood there watching the devastating reality finally crush the last remaining pieces of Spencer's massive ego. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. He looked down at his trembling hands and then looked around the grand ballroom. He saw the disgusted faces of his wealthy relatives and the judging glares of his Wall Street colleagues. He saw his new bride weeping on the floor and realized that his carefully constructed life of luxury and privilege was entirely gone. His brain simply could not process the absolute totality of his defeat. He had always believed that his pedigree and his gender made him naturally superior to a black woman who sold things on the internet. He could not accept that I had outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him, and ultimately bought his entire existence. I watched his pale blue eyes dart frantically around the room, looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. The doors were blocked by my legal team, and the venue was legally my private property. The sheer panic in his eyes suddenly hardened into something much darker and far more primal. It was raw, unhinged rage. He could not beat me in the corporate boardroom, and he could not beat me in a legal battle. His fragile masculinity demanded that he reclaim his dominance in the only way his desperate mind could comprehend. He resorted to physical violence. He let out a loud, guttural scream that sounded like a wounded animal. It was a terrifying sound that completely shattered the quiet tension of the ballroom. He planted his expensive leather shoes firmly on the marble floor and lunged directly across the head table toward me. His hands were curled into tight fists, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure murderous hatred. He wanted to wrap his hands around my throat. He wanted to physically punish me for stripping away his power and exposing him as a fraudulent criminal. Several guests in the front row screamed in terror. Alicia gasped and covered her face. My mother shrank back into her chair, but I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even blink. I knew he was never going to reach me. Before Spencer could even clear the edge of the head table, a massive shadow stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains, situated just to my right. It was Marcus, the head of my private corporate security detail. Marcus was a highly trained former military operative who had been standing silently in the periphery of the room, blending into the shadows since the moment I arrived. He moved with a terrifying fluid speed that completely defied his massive size. Marcus intercepted Spencer mid-lunge. He did not throw a punch. He simply grabbed the lapels of Spencer's custom white tuxedo and used the desperate man's own forward momentum against him. Marcus pivoted sharply, redirecting Spencer's flying body away from me and directly toward the center of the head table. Sitting right in the middle of the table was Alicia's prized possession. It was a towering 5-tier wedding cake covered in flawless white fondant edible gold leaf and dozens of handcrafted sugar roses. Alicia had spent $10,000 on that cake to ensure it was the ultimate symbol of her expensive high society aesthetic. It was a masterpiece of culinary art standing almost 4 feet tall on a heavy silver pedestal. Marcus slammed Spencer face first, directly into the center of the $10,000 cake. The impact was incredibly loud. The sound of a grown man crashing into a dense structure of sponge cake and thick vanilla buttercream echoed violently across the ballroom. The structural integrity of the massive cake instantly gave way. The top 3 tiers completely exploded upon impact, sending a massive shower of white frosting flying into the air. Edible gold leaf and shattered sugar roses rained down on the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy silver pedestal tipped over under Spencer's weight, crashing onto the marble floor with a deafening metallic clang. Spencer collapsed onto the floor, buried under 50 pounds of ruined cake. His pristine custom white tuxedo was completely destroyed. His hair was plastered to his forehead with thick, sticky buttercream. He thrashed around on the ground, slipping and sliding in the massive puddle of vanilla frosting, trying desperately to push himself up. He looked absolutely ridiculous. The terrifying corporate predator who had tried to extort me for $500 million was now reduced to a pathetic clown covered in wedding cake. The facade of the elegant high-class event was completely and permanently shattered. Total chaos erupted in the ballroom. The wealthy Montgomery family completely lost their aristocratic composure. People were shouting and jumping out of their seats to get away from the flying debris. But in the modern world, a public meltdown of this magnitude never goes unrecorded. Within seconds, dozens of smartphones were pulled out. The bright flashes of cameras illuminated the room like a strobe light. The Wall Street executives and the high society guests were eagerly filming the disgraced hedge fund manager, rolling around in a pile of frosting. They knew this footage would be circulating through every elite social club and financial institution in the city by morning. Alicia scrambled backward on her hands and knees, trying to get away from the sticky mess. She stared at the destroyed cake and let out a piercing scream. It was not a scream of concern for her husband. It was a scream of pure, vain agony over the destruction of her perfect aesthetic. Her $10,000 centerpiece was gone, and the man she married was a viral joke playing out on the smartphones of all her wealthiest friends. Marcus stepped forward and firmly planted his heavy boot directly between Spencer's shoulder blades, pinning the struggling man flat against the marble floor. "Do not move," Marcus ordered, his voice deep and completely devoid of emotion. "If you try to stand up, I will consider it a secondary threat to my client, and I will neutralize you permanently." Spencer stopped struggling. He lay flat on his stomach, his face pressed into the ruined fondant. He was breathing heavily, blowing bubbles into the thick frosting. He was completely trapped, humiliated, and physically subdued in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. I stood perfectly still, calmly brushing a tiny speck of white icing off the sleeve of my emerald green tailored blazer. I looked down at the pathetic mess on the floor. The contrast between my absolute total control and his humiliating physical meltdown was the ultimate victory. I had not just taken his money and his venue. I had taken his dignity and forced him to display his true chaotic nature to the entire world. The flashing lights started as a faint reflection against the dark glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. At first, people thought it was just the reflection of a passing ambulance on the distant highway. But the red and blue lights quickly multiplied and grew intensely bright. They swept across the manicured lawns and illuminated the shattered remains of the wedding reception with a harsh, rhythmic glare. The low hum of heavy engines vibrated through the floorboards of the grand ballroom. The guests who were still whispering about Spencer's violent meltdown suddenly fell completely silent. They turned their heads toward the large windows, watching the procession of dark sport utility vehicles pull up directly to the front entrance of my newly acquired estate. I looked down at Spencer, who was still pinned beneath Marcus' heavy boot. He had stopped blowing bubbles in the vanilla frosting. He turned his head sideways, pressing his cheek against the sticky marble floor so he could see the flashing lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. His breath hitched in his throat. He knew exactly what those lights meant. The corporate predators he feared the most had finally arrived. The heavy oak double doors of the banquet hall swung open for the second time tonight. This time it was not my elite corporate legal team. It was a highly coordinated task force of federal agents. Over a dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission printed clearly on their backs, marched into the room. They moved with a strict clinical efficiency that made even Jonathan's ruthless lawyers look polite. The lead agent was a tall, older woman with sharp features and absolutely zero patience for high society drama. She held up her gold badge and loudly announced her presence, completely ignoring the terrified gasps of the wealthy guests. "Nobody move," she commanded, her voice echoing with absolute federal authority. We are executing a federal arrest warrant and a complete asset seizure. My mother let out another pathetic wail and curled herself into a tight ball in her chair. Alicia scrambled further away from her husband, pressing her back against the legs of the head table. She wanted to physically distance herself from the radioactive criminal she had just married. I looked down at Spencer. Did you really think I would wait until Monday morning to deal with you, Spencer? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for him to hear. Did you honestly believe I would let a desperate man with nothing to lose dictate the timeline of my corporate security? He squeezed his eyes shut, as a fresh wave of tears mixed with the white buttercream on his face. I finalized the acquisition of your debt on Wednesday, I explained calmly. On Thursday morning, my legal team packaged the complete forensic audit of Vanguard Horizon, along with all of your forged quarterly statements, and sent it directly to the federal authorities. I gave them the exact routing numbers for the offshore accounts where you tried to hide the embezzled client funds. I gave them everything they needed to build a completely airtight criminal case against you. The extortion attempt you just made in front of 300 witnesses was just the final piece of evidence they needed to secure an immediate arrest warrant. The lead federal agent marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. She did not care that she was interrupting a $500,000 wedding. She did not care about the designer dresses or the expensive floral arrangements. She walked right up to the head table and looked down at the pathetic mess on the floor. Marcus, my head of security, looked up at the agent and gave a short, respectful nod. He slowly lifted his heavy boot off Spencer's back and took a deliberate step backward, allowing the federal authorities to take over. Spencer Montgomery, the lead agent, stated, reading from an official document in her hand. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud securities, fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Two younger agents stepped forward and grabbed Spencer by the arms. They roughly yanked him up off the floor. The sound of the sticky buttercream peeling off the marble tiles was incredibly loud in the silent room. Spencer could barely stand. His legs were completely useless. The agents had to hold him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing back into the ruined cake. He was covered from head to toe in white frosting and crushed sugar roses. His custom-tailored white tuxedo was completely ruined, stained with dark streaks of dirt and grease from the floor. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, the agent ordered, grabbing his wrists. Spencer began to openly sob. It was a loud, ugly sound of total despair. Please, he begged, looking around the room at his wealthy relatives. Please do not let them take me. Somebody call my lawyer. Somebody do something. I am a partner at a major firm. You cannot do this to me. He looked directly at the tables where his prominent family members were sitting. These were the people who had always protected him. These were the people who had always used their wealth and influence to make his problems disappear. But tonight, nobody moved. His uncles and cousins just stared at him with cold, disgusted expressions. They were angry that he had lost their money, and they were furious that he had publicly humiliated their family name. In their elite world, financial failure was a sin, but getting caught was completely unforgivable. They turned their faces away, refusing to even acknowledge his existence. Spencer turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward his new wife. Alicia. Please, he cried out, reaching a frosting-covered hand toward her. Tell them it is a mistake. Call the senior partners at your firm. Save me, Alicia. Alicia stared at him with pure hatred. She did not see a husband. She saw the anchor that was going to drag her down into a lifetime of crippling debt and federal investigations. She stood up, pulling her heavy wedding gown tightly around her body. I want a divorce, she spat, her voice filled with venom. Do not ever speak to me again, you disgusting fraud. The loud metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Spencer's wrists echoed sharply across the room. It was the sound of absolute finality. His fake empire was officially dead. The agents turned him around, and began to march him back down the center aisle of the ballroom. It was the ultimate walk of shame. The cameras on the guests' smartphones were still recording every single agonizing second. They captured the ruined golden child, the bankrupt hedge fund manager being dragged out of his own lavish wedding covered in cake and crying like a completely broken man. The bright red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside flashed across his face, illuminating his total devastation. I stood at the head table and watched him disappear through the heavy oak doors. I felt an incredible sense of closure. The toxic parasite that had tried to consume my family and my life was finally removed. The ballroom was completely silent, save for the heavy breathing of my mother and sister. The federal agents began securing the venue, taping off the doors and instructing the guests to leave the premises immediately. The party was officially over. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the federal agents, taking Spencer away. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining guests had completely fled the venue, eager to distance themselves from the massive scandal. Only my private security team, my lawyers, and the two broken women at the head table remained. I looked at my sister. Alicia was sitting on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the sticky remnants of her ruined wedding cake. She was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow gasps, and her eyes were completely vacant. She was staring at the wall, but she was not seeing the expensive floral arrangements. She was seeing the $15 million debt. She was seeing the end of her legal career and the complete evaporation of her high society dreams. Her life as she knew it was entirely over. My mother, Vivian, could not handle the silence. She slowly slid out of her chair and dropped heavily onto her knees. The expensive silk of her designer gown pooled around her on the floor. She crawled forward, closing the physical distance between us, until she was looking up at me from the ground. Her face was swollen from crying, and her eyes were filled with a pathetic, desperate pleading. "Emily, please," she whimpered, her voice hoarse and broken. "You have to help us. You are the only one who can fix this." I looked down at her. I did not step back, but I did not reach out to comfort her either. I stood perfectly still. "You have billions of dollars, Emily," my mother begged, reaching a trembling hand out to touch the hem of my tailored blazer. $15 million is nothing to you. You could pay off that bridge loan right now. You could save my house. You could hire the best lawyers in the country to keep Alicia out of federal prison. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just leave us like this. Please, Emily, I am your mother. I am begging you to save us." I stared into her eyes. For 32 years, I had desperately wanted this woman to look at me with love and respect. I had wanted her to protect me and support my dreams, but looking at her now begging on her knees, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well had run completely dry. There was no love left. There was no anger left. There was only a firm, unbreakable boundary. I stepped back, pulling the fabric of my blazer out of her reach. "I am not your savior, Mother," I said, my voice completely flat and ice cold. "You chose to invest your love and your loyalty into a fraudulent golden child and a criminal son-in-law. You chose to steal from me to fund their illusions. And now those investments have matured. You are simply reaping exactly what you sowed." My mother let out a loud, agonizing sob. She pressed her face into her hands, rocking back and forth on her knees. "But where will I go?" she cried out. "They are going to take my house. I will have nothing." I looked at her without a single ounce of pity. "The foreclosure agents arrive at your house tomorrow morning," I stated clearly and firmly. "Start packing." Alicia let out a sharp gasp at the sound of my words, but she did not look up. She just curled tighter into a ball on the floor. "You are both completely cut off," I continued, ensuring my final words left absolutely no room for negotiation. "You will never contact me again. My security team has already blocked your numbers, and my legal team has drafted a permanent restraining order. If you or anyone associated with you tries to approach me or my company, you will be arrested immediately. We are no longer family. We are not even strangers. You simply do not exist in my world anymore." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on the two women crying on the marble floor. I nodded to Jonathan and Marcus, who immediately fell into step behind me. I began the long walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. My emerald green power suit stood out against the absolute wreckage of the extravagant event. I stepped carefully around the overturned chairs, the dropped crystal glasses, and the spilled vintage champagne. It looked like a war zone. But for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely at peace. I walked through the heavy oak doors and left the ballroom behind. I walked down the grand hallway and stepped out through the front entrance of the Hamptons estate. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the fresh scent of the nearby ocean. It was crisp and incredibly clean. Sitting at the end of the long circular driveway was my sleek black Maybach. My private chauffeur was standing by the open rear door, waiting patiently for my arrival. As I walked toward the car, I looked up at the dark sky filled with bright stars. For so many years, I had allowed myself to be held captive by the concept of family. I had believed that sharing the same blood meant I had to endure their emotional abuse, their constant belittling, and their blatant theft. I had internalized their toxic narrative and believed I was the problem. But building my empire had taught me the true value of boundaries. In the corporate world, you do not keep investing capital into a failing toxic asset just because you have a history with it. You cut your losses, you liquidate the bad debt, and you aggressively protect your core resources. My family was the worst investment I had ever made, and tonight I had finally bankrupted that relationship permanently. I slid into the luxurious leather seat of the Maybach. Marcus took the front passenger seat and the chauffeur quietly closed my door. The heavy tinted windows rolled up, sealing me inside my safe, quiet sanctuary. As the car smoothly accelerated down the long driveway, I did not look back at the massive estate. I did not care what happened to my mother or my sister. Their future was no longer my responsibility. The heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations and their cruelty was completely gone. I was finally and completely free. They called me ruthless, but sometimes letting them destroy themselves is the only justice you get. Have you ever had to bankrupt a toxic relationship? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of building empires and setting unbreakable boundaries. Share this video with someone who might need the courage to walk away from their own toxic environment. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, your net worth is not just about your bank account, it is about the peace of mind you protect every single day.